Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to my session. I thought maybe my wife and a few others would come, but it's good to see others have come as well. Just in case you want to make a decision, if you want to stay, which is fine, what I'm going to propose to do over our little time together is to talk about curriculum. And as we do that, what I really want to focus on is sort of the way curriculum is addressed and the way curriculum is talked about, more so than other aspects of curriculum. You might think of, like in your schools, do you have what's called a curriculum guide? Those things that list what it is that students are supposed to know. Curriculum guide. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes they're called standards in curriculum. All right? So one of the things that I want to do, and I've taken an interest in, is to think about that a little bit. The standards in curriculum for our schools. And so what I would like to do with you today is to walk through an example from the 16th century. So we want to take a look at a 16th century German Lutheran school reformer by the name of Johannes Sturm. Some of you may have heard of this character. And especially looking at a work that he had on what is called the correct opening of elementary schools of letters in Strasbourg. How many of you have the translated work on Sturm? It's a CPH publication. You have that. Okay. So that's where this is from. I've just borrowed from that resource. So I'm not a great translator or anything like that. You can read it too. It's very interesting. I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, but if you want to go, I have no links to CPH. But I would encourage you that if you have an interest in curriculum, to look at that. I want to give you a little flavor of it today.
Could you say the name of that book?
I think it's just called Johannes Sturm on education. Johannes Sturm, Johannes Sturm, Sturm, on school curriculum. I think that's the title of the book. Is that right?
I think it's Johannes Sturm on education.
Oh, on
By
education.
Liv Spitz, who's a very famous Lutheran scholar.
Yes, yes. So it's a book that if you're interested in curriculum, that you might look at. But it's good for other things too. So I want to do that, and I want to try. You can help me, okay? Because I've been thinking about this for a long time. I don't claim to have all the answers. Just that I find it interesting. I think there are some things that, as we think about curriculum for our schools, I'm not proposing in any way, shape, or form a cut and paste, so to speak. That we say, oh, look at Johannes Sturm, Strasbourg, correct opening of letters. Let's, fake plano, here you go. Here's what I want you to do. Not suggesting that at all. Not suggesting that at all. But are there things that we can, as we hear and look at what Johannes Sturm was proposing as curriculum in the 16th century, are there things that we see there that intrigue us to the point where we say, oh, those are the kinds of things, those are the kinds of goals, those are the sorts of things that we're after here in our day in our schools. And by the way, the little one up here that's making noise has every right, unless she's bothering you. This is my granddaughter. Okay? Lucy. So everyone meet Lucy. We'll put Dylan on the spot. We'll put mine. By the way, Dylan was at the second. Sorry, Dylan. You shouldn't have talked to me. He was at the second CCLE conference at CUW. His parents brought him, and now he's back as a presenter. Sorry, Dylan. I promised I would do that. You now know that I'm a liar. So what I want to do then is take a look at 1846 and the very beginning of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and what happened historically, little bits and pieces there, and some thoughts of what I have maybe you can connect some dots too on the curriculum, okay, looking at curriculum, and then my own suggestions of a way forward. So that's what I want to do. My background is, obviously I'm ordained. I was a Lutheran school teacher, graduate at Concordia Ann Arbor. Biology, math, and secondary ed. Went to CUC, Master's in School Administration, 2000. So any Ann Arbor or CUC grads in here? Okay.
One outside the
All right. Great, glad to have you. And then Concordia Theological Seminary, 2006. So, all right, let's get into it. So Johannes Sturm, this again is Johannes Sturm on, it's called The Correct Opening of Elementary Schools of Letters, 1538, Strasbourg. First of all, Johannes has this to say about sort of the goal of education. He says, we have proposed that the goal of studies is a wise and eloquent piety. That's in us. He also uses the term just educated piety, sort of a couple word summary for Johannes Sturm. One of the things that we have to, I think, be aware of is that when Johannes used that, my understanding that when he uses that frequently in his writings, in the word piety, he assumes the Lutheran faith and the faith lived out via preaching, teaching, studying the catechism, hymns. I mean, he was right on board with all of the catechesis. But for him, in a summary form, that word piety is used. He says, for it behooves all men to cultivate piety, but the educated man is different from the unlearned in the following way. Get this again. The educated man is different from the unlearned in the following way. The former excels in reasoning and in speech. In Johann Sturm's curriculum, I'll get to that because that's what my topic is. Students were brought to school, he was proposing, at either 5, 6, or 7 years of age. Usually 6, about 6 years old. And he, in his work here, he actually calls that 9th grade. So he kind of works his way backwards so that your last year in school would have been 1st grade. Okay, so you got to get that in your mind because we don't have it that way. So the last grade, or the 9th grade, is where the student would be brought to school. And so a 6-year-old, all right, Lucy in about 5.5 years. Well, what were they to study? Well, Sturm says that they were to study letter forms. So this is language, okay? Letter forms, compound forms, and sounds. Sound familiar? Phonics, the way words sounds. Letter forms, write letters. This included, by the way, maybe not what you're thinking, this would have been in Latin. They would have the formal language of education was Latin. So they would have especially dealt with this in the Latin language, even though they were German speakers. Okay. There was also an emphasis on speaking well. Something I probably should have learned from Sturm. Or maybe all of us could learn to do a lot better. But from very early on, they were taught how to speak well. He even distinguishes that in speaking well, for the 6-year-old, there should be an emphasis on teaching the 6-year-old to control the tongue, how the tongue is used in speech, his breathing, how you breathe when you speak, and voice, how the voice is used. So already as a 6-year-old, this was part of bringing up, raising up for an educated piety in the Strasbourg school. Of course, the catechism. Get this, 6-year-olds. The letters of Cicero ought to be introduced. And I have to admit, I'm going to admit my ignorance here. Some of the things I'm going to share here, I have never read. Because I didn't go to Strasbourg school, and I haven't been to school like it. All right? But for instance, letters of Cicero ought to be introduced. And he says, for example, a suggestion would be to his wife, Terentia. Anybody familiar with that word? To his wife, Terentia. And to his freedman, Tiro. I don't even know what those are. Does anybody know what those are? I mean, 6-year-olds were getting this education in 1528. I don't even know what that is. I'll just admit it. It's on camera, too. I really don't. So let me kind of go a little more through here, but it's interesting. In the 8th grade, so when you were 7 years old, Sturm says that there ought to be for that child a training in consciousness. And here he was referring to an award system that he had developed. So at the end of each term, certain periods of time, the way that the children would be encouraged is that it was sort of an academic competition, if you will, but the one who did really, really well, they were to be recognized for their hard studies and so forth. So that was to be done. Kind of remind me of the gymnasium talk that we heard if you were in with Mr. Babisak, but also in academics. And by the way, just to kind of pick up on that too, with Johann Sturm's understanding of gymnasium and gymnasium education in Germany, that really was adapted. I learned this from Dr. Vieth. That was really adapted from the sports arena into education, liberal arts education, the word gymnasium. And you see that a little bit here with the competition and the awarding for those who had done very, very well. And he called it training in consciousness, so that people were aware of how they were doing academically, and that there ought to be a good way in which to encourage the boys who didn't do as well to do better, and those who did well, that they might be encouraged to continue to do well. Sort of that sort of understanding. They studied grammatical distinctions. They also were to read the Eclogues of Virgil. If I hit one, anybody knows that? Other letters to Cicero, just letters to Cicero, Latin speech and translation of speech from every day into Latin. Now, I remember having to do that in New Testament Greek class. Sometimes at the seminary, they'd have those like 1 or 2 sentences where you had to translate back into Greek, the English into the Greek. That was, then you realize whether or not you knew your Greek language or not. The translations we could fumble through if you knew your vocabulary. But now having to write it, 7 years old. 7 years old. The poems were to be read aloud. We had a presentation on that already. Pastor Cholak, I think, spoke on that. Poems were to be read aloud, and then the students were also, that it was to be read aloud in such a way that the students would imitate the speech. So it was that they were to learn, not only be the receivers, but they were to learn presentation from the way that the Latin poems were presented. It was imitatio, it was imitation. By the 7th grade, 8 years old, remember I'm going backwards, Cicero, on friendship and old age. Have I hit one yet? Dr. Haley, know that one? Okay, good, we hit one. You've done some others too? Okay. Okay, you also knew the Eclogue, sorry. I didn't see the nod back there. Good. So, Concordia, Nebraska knows about these. Virgil's Aeneid, selections from Catullus, Tibullus, and Horace. With a note, Only the chaste ones. Remember, this is educated piety, all right? Which tells you what? Even if you haven't read those things, if you're reading through this, tells you what? A lot of garbage. At least when it comes to the lack of chastity. That, classical education isn't about, oh, Horace? Oh, we got to get to that. Here, read this, kid. That's not true at all. But there was a selection. And there was a biblical morality that went into choosing and deciding what not to read. He wrote, "Nothing should enter the boy's ears and minds that is not chaste, pious, elegant, and worthy of a free man, liberalis." Nothing. When he said that, he wasn't only referring to what they read, but also just the oration of the teacher himself. That the room was to be filled with this piety, also included a beauty of language and oration, which was heavily emphasized in Sturm's curriculum. He had advice for training on the memory. He said no more should be read than the power of the memory can support. Although I would suggest to you that education, as you know in your classrooms, those minds, as they become better and better adapt to learning. I mean, we're all going to face that ugly time of the first part of the school year, right? Because everyone's minds, or too many minds, have been fat and flabby. They've gotten that way over the summer months. And then to get them back in gear. But once they are, it's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Impressive. The composition of writing and poetry. He had comments on methods, which really isn't what I'm doing on, but let me digress for just a minute. I find it interesting. His method of teaching included that the student was to have 4 to 5 hours of study each day. It could be divided up, but certainly should be divided up for breaks. And that included even going outside and getting fresh air. That including getting some exercise. That Sturm would not be the kind of person that says that these children should be in their chairs all day long learning Latin. They needed time for a good rest in their education. He also very, very methodologically, pedagogically, if you will, said that new material should not be really introduced until that which has already been introduced was learned well. It wasn't simply a plowing through material. It was not a plowing through material. I am one of this math and also taught science at our school at Faith in Plano. And sometimes that plowing through is a bad habit, right? Plowing through. So anyway, this is Sturm. Moving along through, by the time, so you are reading Cicero throughout the grades, big fan of Cicero. He also, at 9 years of age in the 6th grade, makes the comment that students are to follow and imitate authors throughout the curriculum. Now, I think that this becomes very important for understanding Sturm's idea of curriculum. Let's say it again. Students are to follow and imitate authors throughout the curriculum. In other words, the teacher was, and we hear this term midwife or tutor, but the teacher was to bring the author to the student. The teacher was to bring the author to the student. So that you would be learning from, it wasn't, I mean, yes, you were learning from the teacher, but really in effect, I think as I have read Sturm and trying to get my mind around, it's really that you were learning from Cicero. That's who you were learning from. That the teacher was the bridge, if you would. Okay. Also, 11 years old, 4th grade, Greek grammar was introduced. at 11 years old. There's a whole section on the 12 years old, things that are to be read. Cicero's Topics is to be learned. And you read Cicero's Topics, and here he points out that you read Cicero's Topics to learn the art of distinctions. So here again, Stern points out that you are to learn from that great mind and imitate him. The teacher is then part of that conduit of bringing that thinker to the student. And sometimes he had certain things that ought to be read followed by others. So there was a system to the curriculum. You go here, then go here. For instance, he makes the point that first in the 5th grade, at 10 years old, you should read a few of Aesop's fables, and then after reading that, you are ready for the Olympiacs of Demosthenes, he said. So he had an order, sort of what we use today, a scope and a sequence, to what he thought ought to come first and then second. Great section on what he called, this is methods again, but methods of composing speeches in the mind. He says we ought not, in the 5th grade, which is 10-year-olds, we ought not content ourselves with skill in writing only, but something not written out should be recited from memory. He had what he called 3 kinds of speeches in schools. The written speeches that you'd have a manuscript, the extempore types of speech. But then he also had and distinguished what he called those things that were composed in the mind, where he saw this form of speaking somewhere in between the written and the extemporaneous style. That there would be in your mind formulated a knowledge of what you were going to say, an outline of what you're going to say, maybe even a memorization of certain things that you were going to say. Say it. All right, no notes, like I'm doing. All right. And then there was a whole section on analysis of orators and so forth. And lest I forget it, and I forgot, how much time do we have in this section?
2:20.
2:20? All right. There also, he had specific orders for festival days and sacred lectures. So there's a lot of piety, Christian life is a primary goal of education, as we've said. That the catechism was to be memorized, but it also was to be taught, explained, as he put it. That the students were to know the entire history of Christ and the apostles. They were to know Moses, which is a reference most likely to the Pentateuch. That Greek and Hebrew was to be known, and this is all before 14 years of age. Greek and Hebrew is to be known in order to read and to understand the Scriptures. That music was to be practiced by everyone. No one was let off the hook with music. So anyway, that is Johannes Sturm's 16th century curriculum. There's a lot more I can say, but I don't want to. Anybody have any comments or suggestions or know something more about Johann Sturm than I know? Anybody have any comments about
Pastor
it?
Kieser question, yes. So I'm sitting here thinking as a Latin teacher, what these kids are expected to know in Latin, it does sound like to me, if you have a 5, 6, 7-year-old engaging Cicero, that how they are introduced to Latin, how they are taught Latin, it sounds like to me the manner of teaching Latin to them would have been more immersive as opposed to, lots of paradigm and rigorous study. Any comments on that?
There are others that are better, but let me give it a shot. I think the one thing to remember is that Latin was the language of education. So yes, a large amount of time was spent on making sure the students learned Latin because that was the language which they studied in school, all things. So you could see perhaps more of an emphasis, I think, on Latin. Dr. Beath, go ahead.
Yeah, they were they were not allowed to speak any language but Latin, even on the playground, even when they were playing. I mean, it was just like when the Roman children could speak Latin, and these young children, that's the language that was all around them. And so, yeah, it's kind of different now, but children can learn language. I remember we were in Denmark and we were staying with a family, and there's a 5th grader, I think, who conversation with, he's totally proficient in English. And young children, that's their language learning stage, as we know. And so it's, remarkable what's possible for them. And European children, that's the norm. We Americans are monolingual, and that's I'm ashamed of that when I look at other people. And these were not necessarily, we found that everywhere in Scandinavia, not just even among highly educated people. So
There are other examples. I mean, Johann Sturm is just one, so I cherry-picked him, okay? There are others too. For instance, Johann Bugenhagen, right? Bugenhagen, his school order is Braunschweig. He has, for instance, a training up of the young men during the order of Matins and Vespers, that the readings were to be read in Latin, but also they were to be read only in short phrases in Latin, and then they were to be translated into German. So you do see, in some cases, an overlapping of some of the languages as well. And it kind of depends, I think, a little bit on who is writing the school orders. Sturm in his Latin school, I think, would very closely have followed exactly what Dr. Beath was talking about, a very, very strict use of the Latin language. And the school curriculum I shared with you was from the Latin school.
Yeah. But Latin then was not just language of education, it was the language of Europe. And it was the common language of, not the peasants wouldn't know it and other people wouldn't, but it was a language of business, of government, of military, of law, and so you had these cases. I think Bugenhagen himself, not Bugenhagen, Sturm, he was German, but he went to the University of Paris, and he corresponded with people in England, with Queen Elizabeth, and you could go all over. That's why the Luther's theses, I know, went all over Europe immediately because they were written in Latin, and so that was the lingua franca.
Yes.
So I have a question. I know that Luther, when he wrote on education, in a lot of places he spoke about this should be an education for both boys and girls. What about Sturm? Because you mentioned several times that the boys would be doing this.
Yeah, so what I quoted from here, and we're getting into other things that I was trying to deal more with the curriculum in particular, but yes, the one I quoted from, though, was particularly for a Latin boys' school.
Yeah, it was the Academy at Strasbourg, which was a boys' school.
Right.
Now, there were also girls' schools, liberal arts schools, and there's references to those. At least on this level, the gymnasiums, I think they weren't, boys and girls together usually. I'm not sure when that came into being.
What I'd like to do is jump ahead several hundred years and go to 1864. Because I think for some of us, the question that I had, and this is a bigger question than we'll probably get answered today, but what happened? Right? What happened? And there's a whole, probably books, volumes, but I want to give you a snapshot of at least the situation. 1864, United States of America, early, what became what we are, our Synod, the Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod. This information is an outline of the history of our schools, including the Concordias and other seminary, so forth, is in a book by Wayne Schmidt. Parochial education of parochial schools. It's also it's not a CPH, but it's Wayne Schmidt I think it was a doctoral thesis by this guy named Wayne Schmidt. Anyway, he outlines, he was not trying to track classical education or anything like that. He's trying to track, on a timeline sort of way, the history of schools in Synod. He points out in 1864, the Addison Teachers School was established. So CUC, is that right, 1864?
No.
Who's my CUC person here? Okay, all right. I think they have it on their pillars or something. Don't they have the date
Yeah,
here?
their signs on the
Yeah,
on the
1864.
southeast side of campus.
The first director of the school and professor of what was called the Addison Teacher Seminary was a guy by the name of Reverend J.C.W. Lindemann. Reverend Lindemann. It's interesting to note that the Addison Seminary, Teacher Seminary, was moved. It didn't start in Addison. For 7 years prior, the Teacher Seminary was in Fort Wayne at seminary. That was the Teacher Seminary. From 1857 to 1864. So Lindemann is 37 years old in 1864. He is nominated to be the head of school at CUC, what we now call CUC. And he finds out about this by reading, I think, Der Lutheraner, that he's been nominated. He sees that he's been nominated, and he immediately drafts a letter to President Walther, asking that his name be taken off the possibility of, off the nominations. And he has a list of 6 or 7 reasons, but what I think is very interesting is if we consider curriculum and what happened. One of the things that he mentions is that Lindemann said to Walther, I cannot be the director of a school because I've never ever had a gymnasium education. He was ordained and head of a school. He ended up accepting the position. He got the call, accept the position, with only 2 years of education beyond this 9th grade. Ordained and established as the head of CUC. Sorry, CUC. That's your first president. Walther writes to him, and these letters are available. I haven't read one, but supposedly, according to Schmidt, these are available. Walther wrote to him congratulating him, fully supported his nomination to the post. He was given a colleague, his name was C.A.T. Selle, S-E-L-L-E, who worked with Lindemann to basically teach the teachers of Synod. Selle had no education beyond an elementary education, and had started to teach school at the age of 14. Now, I want to be careful here. I think that they still would have had a pretty doggone good education. Okay, so I don't want to completely make it sound like a graduate from our 8th grade was teaching schools. But I do think that it's important to note that what Lindemann suggested was that he basically did not have or was not reared in a classical education. And maybe we could look at that a couple different ways. I don't think I've had much of a classical education. I think seminary education was probably the closest I had to studying in the original languages, et fontes, reading from the sources, this kind of thing. But at the same time, he felt inadequate for the job. When you look at the course of study then, so we're looking at the curriculum of what teachers were to know. The first curriculum, according to Schmidt, at Addison Teacher Seminary. The courses included subjects such as these: Bible history, the symbolical books, That's good. That's the Lutheran confessions. Geography, English, piano, singing, violin, organ, music theory, catechism, memorization, a class called Introduction to Education, another class on practical catechetics, German, arithmetic, history, natural history, penmanship, and drawing. Not too bad, but what don't you hear that you often hear in almost every classical Lutheran school today? There's no Latin instruction at all. So one of the key differences you start seeing, right? 6 years old, Strasbourg, they, in this formal education, saw Latin being introduced very early. And not only that, but the authors were being named, who you were to study. All right. This curriculum was much different from the Strasbourg curriculum. So it's just sort of a snapshot in time. By the way, it was a 5-year program. The guy, and I don't remember his name, the guy that became the director of schools after Lindemann, after the 14 years. By the way, Lindemann was also the one that started the Schulblatt, now is the LEA Journal, Lutheran Education Journal. Did have a gymnasium education. So we did have that. But what happened is, it never seems to me that, at least synodically speaking, what we would consider the traditional classical liberal arts education, at least at Concordia Seminary and Addison, it at least did not have a very treasured start.
Yeah, well, what happened, pastors were given the gymnasium education. And the gymnasium were things like Concordia Milwaukee, Concordia Bronxville. Most of the Concordias were these, 6-year secondary schools, and that was the gymnasium that Melanchthon invented and that Sturm was doing. And it was very classical. And then, even recently, you had the Concordias with the 6-year program, and then you had the senior college at Fort Wayne for 2 years. That was a finishing school before seminary, and people who've written, I've read things about this. You say, I think Gilbert Mylander or someone said he went to Harvard, and there was not, the education he got at the Fort Wayne Senior College was superior to anything they'd had before. I mean, it was really good. But then that got caught up in our, schism in the 70s, and there was some liberalism, and we changed our schools to fit American education, American college models. But the gymnasium, it was very classical, but it's for pastors. What happened is our synodical father said, well, let's have that for pastors, but
Not
lay
really.
people don't need that.
Right.
And then you had
Of
the
course, those are the ones teaching our children.
Yeah, and so you had a different track for teachers, and so you had teacher colleges teaching in a completely different way. And what they were teaching, I mean, we talk about progressive and classical, but between there was something that we could call traditional education in America, the one-room schoolhouse, 19th century kind of school, and that sounds like what they were teaching, and that was what our parochial schools were like. But that wasn't classical. It was good by our standard, better than progressive,
Right.
but it wasn't really, it was different.
If I may, I'd like to keep moving along. I haven't even got to my one idea here of what we're calling truth statements, but one of the interesting things that also studying looking at the history of curriculum in the United States of America, I'm not talking about just within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, but just in general, there, as Dr. V pointed out, certainly within our Concordia Seminary pastoral education, this class, what we today would call classical education, there also was, I mean, you had some of the universities. Maybe there's a book called The Education of Our Founding Fathers. I don't know if you've ever read that little book, but it's a wonderful little book that talks about the history of our colleges and universities. and their use of what we would call classical education today. In the 19th century, there also developed a field of interest. The psychology was growing. The field of psychology was growing. And as the field of psychology grew, it said a lot about a lot of different things, including what we now call educational psychology class. If you've been to a teacher's training class, you've had an ed psych class, right? Take one of those. It was interesting that as this became such a strong voice in education that for a time it appeared that some of those pursuing classical education, even a public education, begin to use it as sort of a defense of why you should study Latin, why you should study, why you should read the great books. At the same time, there was a problem going on in American society. For instance, the 1889-1890 school year, according to one statistic that I found, only 15% of high school graduates attended college. At the same time, you had the idea of a public education for the masses, public education for all. So there was an emphasis on addressing everybody. There was an accusation that the schools that were pursuing a classical education faced then, was this an education for all? Based upon certain statistics and what people were experiencing, some were saying no. No, Latin education isn't needed for all, because not all were going to college. You see their reasoning. It was necessary to go to college, but otherwise it was not necessary for someone to know. In 1900, almost 90% of public school enrollees dropped out before graduating from high school. I think you still had a lot of people, who've ever served I've been in a rural parish or a rural setting America. There were people that talked about just leaving even grade school so that they could help with the farm. But the rise of educational psychology tells the story of where we get to student behavioral objectives, which is what we have today. Edward Thorndike, 1874 to 1949, sometimes called the father of educational psychology. He was a professor at Teachers College in Columbia University, New York City. It's interesting that Thorndike, in his addition to work in schools, also credited with developing employee exams and testing in factories. So, you have to think of this in terms of what else was going on. Thinking of democratic education, child-centered education, all of this in John Dewey, progressive education. Thorndike discredited classical education and said that more important was a practical design of lessons for children, something that would serve society and serve children. Ralph Tyler, 1902 to 1994, worked in the field of assessment and evaluation. It's interesting that that whole field of assessment was driven during the same time, driven by educational psychology, because there was an effort to make psychology a harder science, data-driven, sort of a science. B.F. Skinner, some of you remember B.F. Skinner, the great behavioral psychologist, said that ideas could be broken down into specific pieces of knowledge, into skills, into their constituent parts, and that these could be taught, but most importantly, that they could be measured. because they were looking at a way to quantify psychology. As early as the 1950s, it was almost standard to see the word behavioral objectives in school curricula. The formal development of behavioral objectives came from a guy named Robert Major from 1923, died just very recently in 2020. Major, of course, laid out what were called the three components of behavioral objectives, which most every one of us who's gone through teacher college knows today. One, what the learner will do, not the teacher. Two, the conditions under which the learner performs. And three, the criteria to judge how well the learner has performed the task. Assessment had to be in the behavioral objective. So, for example, maybe you would have a behavioral objective that sounds like this. Given 20 examples of incorrect verb tense usage, the student will identify and correct a minimum of 16 instances. Or maybe you have seen the abbreviation beginning of all of your behavioral objectives. Student will be able to. Right? These are behavioral objectives. So the goal of education then, from the behavioral psychologist perspective, was that teaching would cause a change in behavior that could be measured. That could be measured. The attitude of the educational psychologist. So it's kind of a rush, but some of the things I guess I want to point out here. We moved from Sturm's idea of having learning from Cicero, learning from the greats, and the teacher being the conduit to learning from the great, to the teacher takes the back seat, but his primary purpose is to cause a behavior difference in the child. That's education. See a little bit of the difference there? See that? One of the things that I began to wrestle with as I began to think about this, for instance, sort of a renaissance of the teacher being more of the main event. Not necessarily student, but for the sake of the student. That our schools focusing more on the content of the material from that author's perspective, or whatever that content is, rather than trying to primarily influence the student's behavior or attitude toward the material. That an education that is concerned with wise and eloquent piety, their exposure to truth and goodness and beauty, rather than simply causing a change in behavior by which a student now merely has just a set of skills. So, this was my idea. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? This was my idea. My idea was to simply take the curriculum that we have and to rewrite the curriculum in this way. Rather than students will be able to rewrite the curriculum in such a way that it would focus on the content to be known by the student. I call them truth statements. And some of the things that I have in these truth statements, you may be, I've heard someone call these, someone said they've heard of this, they call them thesis statements. I call them truth statements. But there is a focus on the subject matter rather than a focus on the student learner. Now, it's for the sake of the student. It isn't like the student is included, but it's a focus on the subject matter for the sake of the student. This is what the student's going to learn. That the teacher then is either the source, the midwife, the conduit of instruction for the sake of the child. But it takes away, doesn't look so much at the student's behavior being the evidence or the ultimate goal in the curriculum, which sort of changes behavior so I'll be able to do something after I've taught. And finally, that the student then is the recipient. So we're not going to take the student out of the picture, but we want the student to be the recipient for the sake of a wise and educated piety. Eloquent piety. So let me give you some examples. Here are some grade 1 English grammar statements. I borrowed these from my teachers. Okay, borrowed these from my teachers. In English, grade 1 English grammar. True statement. A verb shows action and tells what the subject does. See the difference between the student will be able to?
Yeah.
Focuses on content. Okay? The teacher's the teacher, and this is the student is the recipient of these things. Grade 3 science. God created the world in 6 24-hour days. Or animals with backbones are called vertebrates. Or a cold-blooded animal has a body temperature that changes depending on the surroundings. It's just stating the content to be learned. 4th and 5th grade music. The hymn, Savior of the Nations Come, is attributed to Ambrose of Milan. And this is not major stuff, folks. But it's my attempt to help our faculty think about getting away from the student behavioral objectives and simply trying to influence student behavior and to focus on what is to be learned. I have a whole bunch of other examples here. I'm welcome to talk with you about them, but I know I'm probably running out of time. One of the great advantages I also see to this is that it helps the teacher focus on the actual content of the lesson, the subject itself, rather than being primarily worried about changing a student's behavior and figuring out how they're going to assess them. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting that we throw out assessment. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that where the primary emphasis or the primary focus might be, not so much on assessment first, based upon student behavior, but rather than the thing being taught. The last little thing, and I learned this from Dr. Jackie B. If you want to know more about this, she's really the guru. I've just been putting it into practice, something called curriculum mapping, which is very new. You know, it's not classical in any way, but I think it's very useful for classical schools. And I'd be glad to talk with you about that. But basically what I have my faculty do is that we sort of map out the year on an Excel sheet. This is week 1, week 2, week 3. And during these weeks of the school year, all of the truth statements that are addressed that week in the year are put into the spreadsheet. These sentences, these content sentences. And up here it also includes the resources that are being used to teach that class, Saxon Course 3, or if it's Harold Jacobs Algebra 1, or whatever it is that you're using. I think it's very helpful to write that out. And then as it's passed on, we haven't gotten this far yet, really the analysis and the use of the curriculum maps at our school. We're just trying to get the curriculum maps done and in a way that we're happy with them. But at any rate, it gives us a way that even if a new teacher comes in, they'll know the content of what it is that was to be taught. So anyway, I will stop there. Thank you very much. If there's questions, we'll let anybody who wants to go leave, and anyone else who would like to stay and ask a question, you're welcome to do so. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.